Sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the only ones who recognize the truth. The polished ballroom of Harrington Fine Auctions shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as collectors, museum curators, and wealthy patrons quietly settled into their seats. Priceless paintings, rare sculptures, and historic artifacts surrounded the room, each carrying stories that stretched across generations. At the entrance stood 17-year-old Marcus Reed, dressed in a clean but well-worn jacket, holding a carefully sealed envelope that had been entrusted to him by his grandmother only 2 days earlier. He paused for a moment, taking in the elegant surroundings before presenting the invitation that had arrived unexpectedly in his family's mailbox. The receptionist glanced at the invitation, then at Marcus, clearly surprised that someone his age had been invited to such an exclusive event. She politely welcomed him inside, though several nearby guests exchanged curious looks as he quietly walked toward the back of the auction hall. Marcus ignored the whispers. His grandmother had reminded him that respect for others should never depend on whether that respect was returned. She had smiled gently before handing him the old envelope and saying, "Do not open this unless the painting is truly there." Marcus had promised her he would keep that promise. Across the room, billionaire Charles Harrington greeted longtime clients with calm confidence. Although known for his remarkable business success and extraordinary private art collection, he had built an equally strong reputation for supporting museums, restoration projects, and educational foundations. His attention drifted across the room until he noticed the young visitor standing quietly near the last row of seats. Marcus did not appear uncomfortable or intimidated. Instead, he observed every painting with genuine curiosity, studying the craftsmanship rather than the wealthy crowd surrounding him. Before Charles could approach, another prominent collector entered the conversation. Preston Vale carried himself with unmistakable confidence, smiling as though every object in the room already belonged to him. When his eyes settled on Marcus, his expression shifted into amusement. "Young man," Preston said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "these auctions usually require more than curiosity." A few people laughed politely. Marcus looked toward him with calm respect. "I came because I was invited." Preston glanced at the bitter paddle resting on Marcus's chair and smiled again. "Then I hope someone explained how expensive curiosity can become." The laughter grew slightly louder. Marcus simply nodded and thanked him before returning his attention to the display platform. His quiet composure puzzled Charles far more than Preston's remarks. Most teenagers placed in such an uncomfortable situation would have defended themselves or walked away. Marcus did neither. He stood with quiet confidence, as though he had come for something that could not be measured in dollars. Moments later, the auctioneer, Vivian Cole, welcomed everyone to the evening's featured event. Assistants carefully removed a silk covering from an extraordinary 19th-century painting that had recently entered the collection through a private estate sale. As the artwork came into full view beneath the warm gallery lights, Marcus's expression changed instantly. His eyes fixed on the lower corner of the antique frame, where a small carved symbol rested almost unnoticed beneath decades of careful restoration. Without realizing he had spoken aloud, Marcus quietly whispered, "That mark belongs to my grandmother's family." The words were soft, yet in the sudden silence that followed the unveiling, they reached far more ears than Marcus ever intended. The quiet words lingered in the ballroom long after Marcus Reed realized he had spoken aloud. Conversation stopped almost instantly as collectors, museum representatives, and invited guests turned toward the young man standing near the back of the room. The painting remained illuminated beneath carefully positioned gallery lights, its aged wooden frame revealing details that had escaped the attention of everyone who had examined it during the exhibition's preparation. Vivian Cole, the auctioneer, paused before announcing the opening bid. She looked toward Marcus with polite curiosity rather than irritation. "Young man," she said calmly, "would you mind explaining what you meant?" Marcus hesitated. He had not intended to interrupt the evening. His grandmother had only asked him to watch carefully and wait until he was certain. He slowly stepped forward, still holding the weathered envelope against his jacket. "My grandmother showed me a drawing of that carved symbol many years ago," he answered respectfully. "She told me it belonged to a frame that disappeared before I was born." A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Preston Vale smiled dismissively and folded his arms. Stories passed through families are interesting, he said with confidence, but they are not evidence. Several guests nodded politely, eager for the auction to continue. Marcus simply accepted the comment without argument. His grandmother had always reminded him that raising his voice never made the truth stronger. Charles Harrington continued watching from the front row. What caught his attention was not Marcus's claim, but the remarkable composure with which he responded. There was no anger in his expression and no attempt to impress anyone in the room. He spoke with quiet certainty, as though protecting a memory mattered more than winning a debate. Vivian glanced toward the painting again. "Can you identify the symbol?" she asked. Marcus walked only as close as invited, careful never to touch the artwork. He pointed toward the lower corner of the frame. "It looks like an oak leaf beside a small bird. My grandmother called it the blue wren mark. She said her grandfather carved it into every frame he restored by hand." Charles slowly stood from his seat. The room immediately became silent again. "May I examine the frame?" he asked Vivian. She nodded, and a conservator carefully adjusted the display so the lower corner became visible. Charles studied the carving for several moments before looking toward the auction catalog. The published description mentioned decorative floral details, but made no reference to a craftsman's mark. He turned toward the restoration specialist standing nearby. Was this area inspected under magnification? The specialist looked surprised. "Only for structural preservation," she admitted. "We did not believe the carving held historical significance." Preston stepped forward with visible impatience. "Surely we are not delaying a $1 million auction because of an old family story." Charles answered calmly, without taking his eyes from the frame. "History deserves patience. If there is even a small possibility that additional provenance exists, every collector in this room benefits from understanding it before bidding begins." Marcus quietly lowered his eyes, grateful that someone had chosen careful examination over quick judgment. He gently touched the sealed envelope in his pocket, remembering his grandmother's final instruction before he left home. "Do not open it unless someone is willing to listen first." For the first time that evening, Marcus believed that moment had finally arrived. Marcus Reed remained quietly beside the display platform while the restoration specialist carefully examined the lower corner of the antique frame beneath a magnifying lamp. The elegant ballroom, which only minutes earlier had been filled with confident conversation, now held nothing but patient silence. Wealthy collectors who had traveled across the country for the auction leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Charles Harrington stood only a few feet from the painting, his attention fixed on the tiny carved symbol that had unexpectedly changed the direction of the evening. Vivian Cole waited respectfully before continuing the auction, understanding that provenance mattered as much as artistry in the world of historic collections. The restoration specialist slowly lowered the magnifying glass before looking toward Charles with unmistakable surprise. "The carving is original to the frame," she said. "It was not added later during restoration. Someone intentionally placed this mark here when the frame was first completed." A quiet murmur spread through the ballroom once again. Preston Vale folded his arms and gave a polite smile that failed to hide his growing discomfort. "Even if the mark is authentic," he replied, "that does not prove ownership." Marcus nodded calmly before anyone else could answer. "You are right," he said. "A symbol alone does not tell the whole story." Charles glanced toward him with growing respect. The young man had every opportunity to argue, yet he continued answering with honesty instead of emotion. "Then why did your grandmother ask you to come?" Charles asked gently. Marcus looked down at the weathered envelope resting in his hands. The edges had softened with age, and the faded paper carried careful folds from being opened and closed many times before finally being sealed. "She told me that this envelope should only be opened if someone was willing to ask questions before making conclusions," Marcus answered. Vivian stepped closer. "I believe that moment has arrived." Marcus hesitated briefly before carefully breaking the old seal. Inside rested a black and white photograph, a handwritten letter, and a yellowed receipt protected inside a transparent sleeve. He placed each document gently on the velvet presentation table beside the painting. The photograph showed an elderly craftsman standing beside the very same artwork many decades earlier, smiling proudly while holding woodworking tools in his hands. Charles immediately noticed the carved oak leaf and small bird on the corner of the frame. It matched perfectly. Marcus unfolded the letter next. My grandmother told me this was written by her grandfather, he explained softly. The first lines described a commission to restore a treasured family painting for a prominent household shortly after the Second World War. Attached to the letter was a receipt signed by the original estate owner, acknowledging both the restoration work and the distinctive craftsman's mark placed on the frame. Vivian carefully compared the signature with the auction records while the restoration specialist examined the aging of the paper. Both quietly agreed that the materials appeared consistent with the period. Preston's confident expression slowly faded as Charles studied every document with increasing attention. The billionaire finally looked toward Marcus and offered a respectful smile. "You did not come here to interrupt this auction," he said. "You came here to protect the truth behind this painting." Marcus nodded gently. "My grandmother always said that history deserves to be remembered correctly, especially when ordinary people help preserve it." Charles looked once more at the painting beneath the gallery lights and quietly realized that the most valuable discovery of the evening was no longer the artwork itself, but the forgotten story carried inside a simple envelope for generations. Charles Harrington remained beside the presentation table as the restoration specialist carefully arranged the photograph, the handwritten letter, and the original receipt beneath protective archival glass. The atmosphere inside the auction hall had transformed completely. What had begun as an evening devoted to prestigious acquisitions had become a thoughtful search for historical truth. Vivian Cole quietly thanked the guests for their patience before announcing that the scheduled bidding would remain temporarily suspended until the newly presented documents could be reviewed according to professional standards. No one objected except Preston Vale. He stepped forward with measured confidence, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket before speaking. "Historical documents deserve careful examination," he said politely, "but an auction cannot be delayed indefinitely because of an unexpected claim." Charles turned toward him calmly. "No one has declared ownership," he replied. "We are verifying provenance, which is a responsibility every reputable auction house shares." Several museum representatives nodded in agreement. Vivian looked toward the restoration specialist, who carefully compared the receipt with the auction catalog. "The catalog identifies the frame as 19th century, she explained. "These newly presented documents suggest the frame underwent a documented restoration many decades ago by a craftsman whose work was never recorded in our public description. That information should be evaluated before any transfer of ownership takes place." Marcus Reed listened quietly without interrupting. He had not entered the ballroom expecting recognition. His grandmother had only asked him to deliver the envelope if someone chose to seek the truth with fairness. Charles noticed the young man standing respectfully apart from the discussion and admired the patience he had shown throughout the evening. "Marcus," Charles asked gently, "did your grandmother ever explain why she kept these papers for so many years?" Marcus smiled faintly. "She said some people protect valuable objects. Other people protect the stories that give those objects meaning. She believed both responsibilities mattered." Those words settled over the room with unexpected weight. Vivian carefully lifted the old photograph once more. Near the lower edge, a handwritten inscription identified the craftsman by name and thanked him for preserving a treasured family painting after years of careful work. The signature matched the receipt resting beside it. The restoration specialist examined both documents again before looking toward Charles. "The handwriting appears consistent," she said. "The materials also appear authentic for their period, although a complete review should be conducted before reaching any final conclusion." Preston remained visibly dissatisfied. "Then the auction should simply continue while experts investigate later," he insisted. Charles shook his head respectfully. "Collectors deserve complete information before making important decisions. Integrity is worth more than speed." The room grew quiet once again. Even guests who had arrived hoping to compete for an extraordinary painting now seemed more interested in seeing its history understood correctly. Marcus looked at the artwork beneath the gallery lights and remembered his grandmother's final words before he left home. "If they choose honesty over convenience, then they will already be honoring the people who came before us." As Charles studied the weathered frame one more time, he quietly realized that the evening was no longer about determining the highest price a painting could command. It had become an opportunity to decide whether truth itself still held value in a room filled with remarkable wealth. Marcus Reed carefully gathered the photograph, the handwritten letter, and the aging receipt after the restoration specialist finished her preliminary examination. Every document was returned to its protective sleeve before being placed gently back upon the velvet-covered presentation table. The auction hall remained unusually quiet. Instead of discussing bidding strategies or investment values, guests now spoke softly about craftsmanship, family history, and the importance of preserving accurate records. Charles Harrington walked toward the center of the room and addressed Vivian Cole with calm confidence. "I believe every person here deserves complete transparency before this evening continues," he said. Vivian nodded in agreement. "Our responsibility is not only to sell remarkable works of art, but also to protect the integrity of their history." Preston Vale remained unconvinced. "The painting has already passed multiple reviews," he replied. "One family story should not outweigh years of accepted documentation." Charles answered respectfully. "No honest discovery diminishes history. It strengthens it." Several museum directors quietly expressed their support, explaining that provenance research often revealed forgotten contributors whose names had never appeared in official records. Marcus listened without interruption. He had no desire to embarrass anyone. His grandmother had taught him that restoring the truth should never become an opportunity to humiliate another person. Charles noticed the young man's quiet restraint and found himself increasingly impressed by his character. "Marcus," he asked gently, "is there anything else inside the envelope?" Marcus looked down for a moment before carefully removing one final folded sheet of paper. Unlike the earlier letter, this document appeared newer, though still many years old. "My grandmother wrote this herself," he explained. "She told me it should only be shared if people chose fairness before profit." Vivian accepted the page with Marcus's permission and quietly read its contents. Her expression softened almost immediately. She looked toward Charles before reading one passage aloud. "My grandfather never claimed ownership of the painting. He only hoped history would remember the hands that preserved it. Every work of art belongs to many people across generations, including those whose names are often forgotten." Silence settled across the ballroom once again. Charles lowered his eyes thoughtfully. "That is an extraordinary lesson," he said. The restoration specialist compared the family letter with the archival records and discovered another important detail. A restoration invoice mentioned in Marcus's documents matched an entry preserved in the auction house's oldest ledger, although the craftsman's name had faded beyond recognition over time. The dates, locations, and description of the painting aligned perfectly. Vivian closed the ledger with a quiet smile. "Your grandmother protected evidence that fills a missing chapter in this painting's history," she said. Marcus simply nodded. She believed every family deserved to have its honest work remembered. Charles looked around the ballroom at the collectors, curators, and guests who had arrived expecting an evening centered on remarkable wealth. Instead, they had witnessed something far more valuable. Before anyone placed another bid, the room had been reminded that the greatest treasures were not measured only by their market price, but also by the truth carried within the people who had cared for them across generations. Charles Harrington remained standing beside the presentation platform as Vivian Cole carefully closed the archival ledger and returned it to its protective case. The quiet dignity that had settled over the ballroom now felt stronger than the excitement that usually accompanied a prestigious auction. Collectors who had arrived expecting to compete for a valuable masterpiece found themselves reflecting instead on the generations of ordinary people whose careful work had allowed great art to survive. Marcus Reed stood quietly near the display, holding his grandmother's envelope with both hands. He had shared everything she had entrusted to him, asking for nothing in return except that the story be heard fairly. Charles looked toward Marcus with genuine respect. "Your grandmother preserved more than documents," he said. "She preserved the character of the people who came before us." Marcus smiled gently. She believed history should remember every honest hand, not only the famous names. Vivian nodded thoughtfully before addressing the guests. "After reviewing the newly presented materials, we have confirmed that the restoration records belong with this painting's permanent provenance file. Future exhibitions and publications will acknowledge the craftsman whose work protected this frame for generations." A quiet round of appreciative applause filled the room. It was not loud or celebratory. It carried the warmth of people recognizing that something important had just been restored. Preston Vale remained silent. His earlier confidence had gradually given way to thoughtful reflection. Charles approached him with courtesy rather than criticism. "There is no shame in learning something new," he said calmly. "Every collector depends upon the truth, even when it arrives unexpectedly." Preston lowered his eyes for a brief moment before offering a respectful nod. "I allowed the value of the object to distract me from the value of its history," he admitted. Marcus heard the words and responded with kindness. "My grandmother always said that people deserve room to grow after they discover the truth." Charles appreciated the quiet grace with which the young man answered. It reflected the same generosity found throughout the family letters resting inside the envelope. Vivian then returned to the auction podium. "With the updated provenance acknowledged, we may continue according to the highest professional standards." Charles slowly reached for his bitter paddle. Several collectors did the same, understanding that the painting now carried an even richer and more complete history than before. The opening bid echoed gently across the ballroom, followed by another, and then another as respectful competition began. Marcus watched without excitement or disappointment. He had not come to purchase the artwork. He had come to ensure that the forgotten craftsman who restored it would finally be remembered. Charles noticed Marcus preparing to step quietly toward the exit, believing his responsibility had ended. "Please stay," Charles said warmly. "This evening is no longer only about the painting. It is also about honoring the people who protected its story." Marcus paused and returned to his place near the front of the room. As the bidding steadily climbed, Charles quietly realized that the highest value being established that evening was not simply the price attached to an extraordinary work of art. It was the renewed commitment that truth, gratitude, and integrity would remain inseparable from its legacy for every generation that followed. The bidding continued with measured confidence as the illuminated numbers on the display climbed steadily higher. Vivian Cole announced each offer with calm precision, while collectors evaluated the painting not only for its artistic significance, but also for the newly restored chapter of its history. Charles Harrington remained composed, raising his bitter paddle only after thoughtful pauses. Every bid reflected careful judgment rather than competition alone. Marcus Reed stood quietly near the presentation table, watching the process with peaceful detachment. He felt no desire to influence the outcome. His grandmother had always reminded him that the value of truth could never be measured by the amount someone was willing to pay for an object. Preston Vale remained in the bidding as well, though his expression had softened considerably since the evening began. The earlier confidence that had drawn smiles from the audience had given way to quiet reflection. Each new bid reminded him that history carried responsibilities beyond ownership. Vivian announced another substantial offer before looking toward Charles. Without hesitation, Charles lifted his paddle once more. The room fell silent as the newest amount appeared on the display, surpassing every previous bid of the evening. Several museum representatives exchanged respectful glances, recognizing that the painting had reached an extraordinary valuation. Vivian looked carefully across the ballroom. "Any further bids?" she asked. Preston studied the painting for several long moments before slowly lowering his paddle onto the table. He smiled faintly toward Charles. "Some things deserve a different kind of victory," he said quietly. Vivian waited a few more seconds before bringing the auction hammer gently down. "Sold." Warm applause filled the room. Charles accepted the congratulations graciously, yet instead of stepping toward the painting immediately, he turned toward Marcus. Every conversation gradually faded as the billionaire walked across the ballroom and stopped in front of the young man. Charles smiled with sincere respect before speaking clearly enough for everyone present to hear. "Marcus, this painting now belongs to me by auction, but its complete history belongs to everyone willing to preserve the truth." He gestured toward the restored provenance documents displayed beside the artwork. "Would you please tell us about the craftsman whose careful work allowed this masterpiece to survive?" Marcus looked briefly at the envelope in his hands before unfolding one final handwritten page from his grandmother. His voice remained calm and steady as he read the opening lines. She had written that her grandfather believed every restored frame represented an act of gratitude toward the original artist, because preserving beauty was itself a form of service to future generations. The ballroom remained completely silent. Collectors, curators, historians, and guests listened with genuine attention. When Marcus finished reading, no one hurried to speak. Charles quietly approached the painting and addressed Vivian. Please prepare the documentation transferring this work on long-term loan to the City Museum. A gentle murmur spread across the audience. Charles continued with a warm smile. The updated gallery plaque should include every verified contributor to this painting's history, including the craftsman whose name was forgotten for far too long. Marcus lowered the letter and looked toward the painting with quiet gratitude. For the first time that evening, he realized his grandmother's wish had never been about recovering a valuable object. It had always been about restoring a forgotten name to the place where it rightfully belonged. The applause gradually faded into a quiet atmosphere of reflection as guests gathered around the presentation platform to study the newly updated provenance documents. No one seemed eager to leave. Conversations that had once centered on market values and record-breaking sales now focused on craftsmanship, gratitude, and the remarkable journey that had reunited a forgotten name with an extraordinary work of art. Charles Harrington stood beside the painting while museum representatives discussed the conservation process that would accompany its transfer to the City Museum. Vivian Cole carefully supervised the preparation of every document, ensuring that each historical record reflected the newly verified information. Marcus Reed remained near the front of the ballroom, holding his grandmother's envelope with the same care he had shown from the moment he entered the building. Although many guests approached to congratulate him, he accepted every kind word with quiet humility. My grandmother would have been happy that people listened, he said gently. That is all she ever hoped for. Charles overheard the remark and smiled warmly. She gave this evening a gift that no amount of money could purchase, he replied. She reminded every one of us that preserving truth is one of the greatest responsibilities we share. Nearby, Preston Vale slowly approached Marcus. His confident manner had disappeared, replaced by genuine sincerity. He extended his hand respectfully. I judged you before I understood why you came, he admitted. I appreciate the grace you showed when you could have answered my words with anger. Marcus accepted the handshake without hesitation. My grandmother taught me that respect becomes meaningful when it is offered even after misunderstanding. Preston nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the wisdom behind the simple answer. Vivian then invited everyone to gather around the painting one final time before it was prepared for museum transport. The restoration specialist carefully pointed to the small carved oak leaf and bird that had begun the entire conversation. Beside the artwork, a newly printed information card had already been prepared. It acknowledged the original artist, the documented restoration completed decades earlier by Marcus's great-grandfather, and the historical evidence that had restored this missing chapter. Several historians quietly photographed the updated records, grateful that future generations would now encounter a more complete account of the painting's journey. Charles looked toward Marcus once more. When this painting is unveiled at the museum, I hope you and your grandmother will stand beside it with us. Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. She is no longer able to travel very far, but I know she would be honored simply knowing the truth reached its destination. Charles reflected on those words as the evening drew to a close. He realized that the greatest transformation had not occurred in the auction catalog or the museum records. It had taken place within every person who had witnessed the events of the day. Wealth had opened the doors of the ballroom, but humility had opened every heart inside it. As the carefully protected painting was prepared for its new home, Marcus quietly slipped the now empty envelope back into his jacket. Its purpose had finally been fulfilled, carrying not only old papers across generations, but also a promise that honesty, dignity, and compassion would always outlast the highest bid ever placed in the room. Several weeks later, the City Museum welcomed visitors to a quiet ceremony unlike any it had hosted before. Morning sunlight poured through the glass ceiling, filling the central gallery with a warm glow that reflected gently across polished wooden floors and carefully restored works of art. At the center of the exhibition stood the painting that had brought together so many unexpected lives. Beneath it, a newly engraved plaque displayed not only the name of the original artist, but also the name of Marcus Reed's great-grandfather, acknowledging the master craftsman whose careful restoration had preserved the frame for generations. Museum visitors paused to read every line, many smiling as they discovered that history had become more complete because someone had chosen honesty instead of silence. Charles Harrington arrived quietly without the attention that usually followed him. He greeted museum staff before walking toward Marcus Reed, who had accompanied his grandmother, Grace Reed, to the ceremony. Grace moved slowly with the assistance of a cane, but her eyes brightened the moment she saw the painting hanging beneath the gallery lights. She remained silent for several moments before gently placing her hand over Marcus's. "Your great-grandfather would never have imagined this day," she whispered. "He always believed that doing careful work was its own reward." Marcus smiled softly. "Now everyone will know his name." Charles approached them with genuine warmth. "More importantly," he said, "they will know his character." Grace looked toward Charles with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for choosing fairness when it would have been easier to ignore us." Charles gently shook his head. "I only followed the example your family set long before I arrived." Nearby, Vivian Cole joined the conversation carrying a framed copy of the updated provenance records. She presented it to Grace with both hands. "These belong with your family," she said. "The originals will remain in the museum archives, but this record recognizes the contribution your family made to preserving an important piece of history." Grace accepted the gift carefully, her eyes filling with emotion. Around them, visitors continued reading the display, many stopping to admire the small carved oak leaf and bird that had nearly gone unnoticed for decades. Parents quietly explained the story to their children, emphasizing that every great achievement often depended upon people whose names were seldom remembered. Charles reflected on those conversations with quiet satisfaction. The painting had found a permanent home, but its greatest purpose was no longer artistic recognition alone. It had become a reminder that dignity could be restored through truth, patience, and compassion. Before leaving the gallery, Marcus took one final look at the artwork and then at the plaque beneath it. He did not see a priceless painting or a record-breaking auction. He saw a promise fulfilled across generations. As sunlight continued to illuminate the gallery, Charles realized that the most valuable legacy created that day could never be measured in dollars. It lived instead in every visitor who paused to remember that true greatness belongs not only to those who create remarkable things, but also to those who quietly preserve them with honesty, humility, and kindness for the generations still to come.